the last chapter of this course. Yay! Chapter 14, Emancipation and Reconstruction. So we're going to go back a little bit, you'll notice, before the end of the war from 1863 until the end of what we officially call Reconstruction of the South, which ended in 1877. So let's talk about emancipation. Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation back before the war was even over, and if you will recall, that Emancipation Proclamation only applied to states in rebellion. That did not apply to any of the states that still held slavery, but that were loyal to the Union, so those 4 states that were considered the border states. However, what we've learned by reading is that this does turn into a war about slavery, right, an ending of slavery. So at the war's conclusion, African Americans throughout the South celebrated their freedom. And the end of the war, it really brought different emotions for white Southerners. Some whites took out their anger in violent ways on newly emancipated blacks, once Union troops were no longer there to provide for protection. Poor housing and malnutrition made African Americans particularly susceptible to disease, such as like smallpox, which killed more than 60,000 freed people throughout the 1860s. African Americans demonstrated their new independence in various ways. A lot of them attended school. Education was a big thing for all ages. They also created new churches, black churches only, and then we have the Freedmen's Bureau, and private organizations helped African Americans on their transition to freedom. Newly freed blacks, they sought to reunite with family members who had been separated, and that separation was, perpetuated by the slave system. Husband and wives, likewise, they would search for each other using all means at their disposal to locate their spouses. Separation and the lack of legal standing for slave marriages made the reunion of spouses more difficult, and we do see in some cases a husband or wife may have remarried while separated from his or her original spouse. Other reunited spouses sought to legalize their marriages as quickly as possible. On the flip side of that, for unhappily married couples, freedom offered a chance to end those relationships. Having children, it does complicate the issue, and in cases where both parents sought custody, the father typically prevailed. Just keep that in mind, that's kind of a cultural thing during the 1800s, and even into the early 1900s, when couples split like that and divorce happened, seeking custody was usually granted to the father, not the mother. Education offered another way for African Americans to act on their freedom, and we see a lot of black communities and churches opening up. We also see Northern Charitable Organization and the Freedmen's Bureaus all open schools for African Americans, providing valuable resources for the newly freed people. The desire for education meant that African Americans utilized any available building as a schoolhouse. So you would see sometimes brand new schoolhouses built, but sometimes it would be like the local black church, or maybe even like a saloon would be turned into a church setting, or a local saloon would be turned into a school setting. Parents worked to ensure that their children could attend school and possibly bring home their lessons for family members who were unable to attend because of their work. Some adults attended school at night once their work was done, so that's kind of showing you it wasn't just young children, it was all the way like older adults wanted that schooling as well. African Americans viewed education as important for a variety of reasons. First, it symbolized freedom. It could prevent exploitation in labor contracts, like being able to read the contract and be like, no, this is crazy. You're going to take 90% of my income. Having that ability to actually read what you're getting into. It also offered a way to reconnect with family members separated during slavery, and it allowed African Americans to participate in the political process. The enthusiasm among African Americans for schooling was not enough to combat the limits of education, including funding and teacher shortages by 1880. Only a quarter of African Americans were literate. Here's an example of a freedmen's school. So this was set up by the Freedmen's Bureau, and you can tell there it's kind of your typical one-room schoolhouse where all ages are taught together. Freedom offered African Americans a chance to interpret the Bible and religion without white influence. That was a big deal too. Black churches were at the center of communities, serving as places to congregate for religious, educational, political, and social reasons. As sites for political organizing, black churches offered a setting unencumbered by white interference. Because if you'll recall, before, if more than 2 or 3 blacks met together, even for church services, you always had to have a white person present. So having the ability to worship freely without white influence was a huge deal, and also not hearing necessarily a white Southern interpretation of the Bible, where it sticks to that one verse about obey your masters, slaves obey your masters. We're no longer dwelling on that one verse and really taking it out of context anymore. So Abraham Lincoln, he does have a plan for reunification. This is, 1863, 1864 before he's shot. And he issues the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, and it really only offered mild terms under which Southern states and individuals could be readmitted into the Union. Congressional Republicans argued that more punitive measures were necessary, and in 1864 passed the Wade-Davis bill, which made it more difficult for Southern states to be readmitted. Lincoln is going to use a pocket veto to block the Wade-Davis bill. So what Lincoln does instead is he took a balanced approach in efforts to reunite the Union and help Southern blacks. Unfortunately, his assassination in April of 1865 moved Andrew Johnson into the presidency, and Johnson has a completely different view for Reconstruction. Johnson's personal and political history gave him a perspective on how to achieve Reconstruction that was different from that of the Republicans. Because of his background as an impoverished Southerner, a poor Southerner, Johnson was opposed to slavery on the grounds that it benefited wealthy planters rather than being opposed to slavery for any moral reasons. He saw Reconstruction as a way to punish the wealthy while allowing the South to quickly and easily re-enter the Union. Johnson wasn't able to work even with more moderate Republicans who viewed the federal government as having a responsibility to help newly freed people attain basic civil rights. So radical Republicans such as Senator Charles Sumner and Congressman Thaddeus Stevens supported full voting rights for African Americans and the redistribution of planters' land. Radical Republicans' views were the minority opinion, just like most radical, politicians and most radical politics are. It was usually a minority opinion. But all Republicans believe that Congress should take the lead in Reconstruction. It should not be left up to the president. So initially, Johnson's actions regarding Reconstruction encouraged Republicans, even in spite of his policy of requiring members of the Southern aristocracy to petition him personally for amnesty. So you have to write to the president and ask for forgiveness. Pretty much, that's what Johnson wanted. Moderate and radical Republicans disagreed with Johnson's assessment that all Southern states had to fulfill requirements for readmission by December of 1865. His liberal policies, for example, had allowed former Confederate leaders back into positions of political leadership in Southern states. And even Mississippi had rejected the 13th Amendment. They rejected the ending of slavery. Southern states passed black codes that were designed to limit blacks' freedoms and rights, in many ways reviving aspects of slavery. Northerners were appalled by the black codes, as they appeared to recreate the Old South and, in practice, negate abolition and much of the war. So we did all of this just to have blacks go into this state of slavery again, where they're not allowed to move around, they're not allowed to own land, they're not allowed to do a lot of things that should have been granted at the end of the war. But we see Southern states passing these very restrictive black codes or black laws. They're going to be known as Jim Crow laws eventually. So what happens? Well, President Johnson and congressional Republicans had reached an impasse by December of 1865. They cannot agree on anything. And Johnson worsened the situation by vetoing congressional acts designed to benefit African Americans. He vetoes the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Johnson defended his vetoes on constitutional grounds. However, his personal beliefs regarding slavery, such as that the true evil of slavery was the harm it did to poor whites, not to the people that were actually enslaved. No harm is done to them, is what he believed. Those were the true basis for his vetoes. Congress overrode his vetoes through the unification of moderate and radical Republicans. Congress subsequently passed the 14th Amendment in response to escalating racial violence in the South. The 14th Amendment provided citizenship rights and protections to African Americans. The amendment did not grant suffrage voting, and it even allowed any state to exclude blacks from voting if the state was willing to accept reduced representation in Congress. Johnson actively encouraged Southern states to reject the 14th Amendment, and his aggressive campaigns against Republican lawmakers ultimately resulted in increased support for the Republican Party, as evidenced by the party's victories in the 1866 midterm elections. The Republican-dominated Congress moved to secure voting rights for African Americans in 1867, and it also passed 3 military Reconstruction Acts. Congress then moved to limit Johnson's power through the Tenure of Office Act, which required that the President obtain the consent of the Senate before removing any appointed official that the Senate had previously approved. Guess what? Johnson's going to remove someone. He considered the Tenure of Office Act to be unconstitutional, and he fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who was sympathetic to radical Republicans, without Senate approval. Radicals in Congress responded by drawing up articles of impeachment against Johnson. The House voted to impeach Johnson, but radicals failed to get the 2/3 vote in the Senate necessary to convict Johnson. It was 1 vote shy of convicting Johnson. Johnson remained in office, but what Congress does is they take away his presidential power. So he has very limited power to affect Reconstruction policy going forward. And what we're going to see happening is, as we go forward in time, up until we get to about Roosevelt in the early 1900s, all these presidents between Johnson and Roosevelt have very limited power. They're what we call weak presidents. You probably don't even know their names, except for maybe Ulysses S. Grant, the general. He becomes president, but you probably don't remember hearing about McKinley or Chester Arthur or Garfield, some of those that we really don't talk a whole lot about because they're not very strong presidents because Congress took away their power. This is a Democratic flyer opposing the Freedmen's Bill. So you'll remember Republicans, we'll just say for the most part, were anti-slavery. They were against slavery. They're Northerners. Democrats are the Southerners that are for slavery, right? So our political parties and alignments, they haven't switched to what they are today. So think of them kind of in opposite terms when we're talking about the 1800s and political parties. So this is talking about the Freedmen's Bureau, and it says an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. Twice vetoed by the president and made law by Congress. Support Congress and you support the Negro. Sustain the president and you protect the white man. If you want to tell me that this isn't about race and we don't have racism, this proves the point that there is racism, and it's a systemic problem that we've had even before the end of the Civil War. Because all this is, if you'll notice, all this is talking about is white versus black. These are the military district boundaries that were drawn up. So we're going to go into, military law during Reconstruction. You'll notice the different districts. So Virginia is all by itself. Right, and then you've got District 2, which is North Carolina, South Carolina. District 3 is Alabama, Georgia, Florida. District 4 is Arkansas and Mississippi. And District 5 is Texas and Louisiana. You'll notice Tennessee had already been readmitted before had already been readmitted before these districts were drawn up. So in February of 1869, Congress is going to pass the 15th Amendment, which prohibited voter discrimination based on race. However, there are loopholes in that amendment, and those loopholes allowed whites to continue limiting black suffrage. The American Equal Rights Association, made up of former American Anti-Slavery Society members, became divided over the 15th Amendment. The amendment's failure to provide voting rights for women was criticized by former abolitionists, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Former allies with the abolitionist movement split over the 15th Amendment's failure to include women. Stanton denounced the amendment on racial grounds, arguing that it degraded the U.S. polity and that white women should be granted the same right as immigrant and African American men. Competing women's suffrage organizations emerged from this divide. So we're going to see like the women's movement really started in the 1840s, but it's really going to pick up over the 15th Amendment because for the first time, citizens are defined as being male. So that's what their argument is. And it denies women the ability to come out and vote. That was kind of another thing that women wanted. So this is the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. So Stanton and Anthony, they formed the National Woman Suffrage Association, open only to women, and opposed the 15th Amendment. And then you have others forming the American Woman Suffrage Association, not national, but just American women. And that was open to men and women in support of the amendment. In response to the passage of the 15th Amendment, women's suffragists attempted to use the 14th Amendment to gain female suffrage. And we have a court case. And Virginia Minor argued that her right to vote was one of the privileges and immunities of citizens protected by the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled against her, denying national female suffrage. Some white Southerners who had lacked power before the war, like small farmers, they joined Republicans in reconstructing the South. Most whites, however, continued their support of the Democratic Party in the South, and they denounced Southern Republicans as scalawags. Northern whites moved to the South during Reconstruction for a variety of reasons, but Southern Democrats dismissed them as carpetbaggers because of their alliances with African Americans. African Americans began participating in Southern politics, casting votes, and winning a wide range of elected positions, including seats in the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. Male and female African Americans viewed political participation, both formal and informal, as an important aspect of freedom. A coalition of blacks and sympathetic whites produced reforms in the South, such as a public school system, an improved transportation system, and greater levels of democracy. Blacks were limited economically, and many turned to sharecropping as a means of economic survival. So let's talk about that for a second. White landowners were typically the beneficiaries in sharecropping arrangements, which in many cases turned into a form of virtual slavery for African Americans. Some black farmers were able to overcome the difficulties of sharecropping and achieved a measure of economic success and labor independence. Changes in the Southern economy and agricultural system did not eradicate pre-war divisions. For the most part, white elites still held power over blacks and poor whites. Seeking to find true independence, many blacks left the South for new opportunities in the West, where they created their own communities. And these migrants, they become known as exodusters. So African Americans leaving the South, traveling to the West, that's what we call exodusters. And here's a picture of some for you. So this are two families, two couples, they're homesteaders, and they are what we would consider exodusters. They left the South believe they settled in Kansas. White Southerners claimed that the new interracial governments of the South increased corruption. However, corruption was a result of new business opportunities and a desire among unscrupulous businessmen and politicians to accumulate wealth. Republicans had limited opportunities to reconstruct the South. All of the former Confederate states were readmitted to the Union by 1870, and Republican state governments were voted out in favor of Democratic ones. Furthermore, very few rebels were legally held accountable for their roles in the Civil War. Only one was executed for war crimes, and one high-ranking official, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, he went to prison. Southern Democrats identified themselves as redeemers who could restore the Old South and bring back its former glory. Redeemers earned power through voter intimidation and violence as epitomized by the Knights of the KKK. In 1870 and 1871, Congress attempted to limit the KKK's efforts by passing 3 Force Acts, which empowered the president to dispatch officials to the South to supervise elections and prevent voting interference. The acts led to some 3,000 prosecutions and forced the Klan to disband, but other vigilante organizations arose to take its place. White Northerners who had fought for black rights and suffrage still held racist views, and many began to agree with white Southerners who claimed blacks were incapable of governing effectively. Outraged by the scandals and corruption that had plagued Grant's first term, a group of liberal Republicans nominated Horace Greeley to run against Grant in the 1872 election and called for the end of Reconstruction, arguing that it caused the high levels of corruption. Seeing a chance to defeat Grant, the Democrats endorsed Greeley, but Grant's popularity proved insurmountable. Grant and the majority of Republicans waved the bloody shirt to remind voters of the soldiers who had died in war. Congress began taking steps to end Reconstruction and to allow former Confederates to hold elected office again. When Democrats regained control of the House of Representatives in 1874, they began efforts to remove troops from the South. An economic panic in 1873 resulted in strikes throughout the nation, diverting Republican attention from Reconstruction. Simultaneously, Supreme Court rulings in the mid-1870s curbed black rights and limited protections for African Americans. The Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes for president in 1876, and the Democrats nominated Samuel Tilden. Both candidates highlighted their efforts to end corruption. 20 disputed electoral votes put Tilden's victory in the popular vote in question. To decide the election, Congress established a 15-member Joint Electoral Commission that was intended to have equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans and one independent. When the independent commissioner resigned, he was replaced by a Republican. And guess what? The Republicans win. Hayes was declared the winner. To ensure Hayes' certification, his supporters negotiated with Southern Democrats in the Senate, securing their support in exchange for Hayes agreeing to remove troops from the South, 2, to appoint a Southerner to his cabinet, 3, to endorse a transcontinental railroad with a southern route. And those 3 things, they're known as the Compromise of 1877, and that marked the end of Reconstruction and the federal protection for African Americans in the South. Here's a voting map for you to look at. So you can see the electoral votes, 185 to 184. And you'll kind of notice like the popular vote was off. That's why they had to do this joint electoral commission to see. Basically what ends up happening is the Democrats just kind of give in and let Rutherford B. Hayes become president in this Compromise of 1877. But I just want to point out, as we're moving forward in history and you take a 1302 course, note things do not get better for African Americans. It's only going to get worse, especially in the South, because there's no protection anymore. We don't have military protection for blacks in the South, and we really don't have the government's protection. State laws don't really secure the rights or protections of African Americans moving forward. You're going to see a lot of lynchings. You're going to see a lot of injustice being done, and that's going to be something that we will talk more about in 1302.